Hello and welcome. My name is Randy Bell, and I am the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third of our four special events that the Atlantic Council is hosting virtually as part of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. We were supposed to be in Abu Dhabi this week for our annual Global Energy Forum, which is part of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. But due to the COVID case numbers in the US and Europe, we decided to postpone until March 28th and 29th. We will have more information on the plan for the forum in March in the coming weeks, so please watch this space. Now, today's session is on what is perhaps the hottest topic in energy for the past 2 years, hydrogen. There's a tremendous amount of debate in energy circles about hydrogen, how it's produced, what sectors should use it, and how to accelerate its deployment. Today, we will be addressing some of these questions, but our real aim is to look at how hydrogen could become an energy system integrator. So tying together the worlds of electrons and molecules, leveraging the expertise of both the hydrocarbon and renewable energy sectors, and decarbonizing hard to abate sectors. It is my pleasure to introduce our fantastic speakers. We have with us today Marco Alvara, the Chief Executive Officer at SNAM, Meg Gentle, the Executive Director of Highly Innovative Fuels USA, David Livingston, the Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, at the Department of State, and then Alexander Richel, the Head of Technology at Masdar. I will be the moderator today because there's nothing I enjoy more than leading a conversation about hydrogen, as I think some of you have seen recently. If you in the audience have any questions for our guests, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will try to get to as many of these as we can. We have an hour today. We do have a hard stop at 9 a.m. Eastern. So let's get started. Now, I want to go to the whole group first to kick this off. And we'll just go in alphabetical order in terms of response. So Marco, then Meg, then David, then Alexander. So the question for the whole group first is, how can the development of a hydrogen economy help integrate the energy system and link decarbonization of the power sector to other key sectors? So Marco first.
I think you're spot on. It's really about integrating the various parts. And we've had for too long a debate whether it was going to be molecules and electrons. I think what hydrogen does, because it's a molecule, but you can make it with electrolyzers through electrons, you're simply bridging the gap, and it really helps the sector coupling. So hydrogen allows us to produce great quantities of renewable energy where there's no grid, where there's no market, and we can then produce hydrogen from the renewable energy, and we can easily transport that hydrogen, whether through liquid hydrogen, through ammonia, through methanol, directly via pipes. We can move it to where the markets are. So it's a way to essentially bridge this existential gap we've had in the energy world between the oil and gas people and the utilities on the electricity side. It's a way to bring the two worlds together. And it's really a way to get cheaper molecules. Eventually, we'll have cheaper hydrogen than we have oil and gas today. And so it's a way to not only be able to replace like for like when it comes to replacing the fuels we use today to make steel, cement, to make heating, to drive ships, but it's also a way to fully decarbonize these hard to abate sectors as well.
Marco, thank you so much. And I think you teed up Meg very well. So Meg?
Yeah, I was thinking exactly that. Hello, Marco. Good to
Hi.
see you. And Randy, thank you for having me on the group today. I completely agree that with Marco that hydrogen provides the grid for electricity from faraway markets and should be able to bring renewable electricity to market by turning it into a molecule and eventually as a fuel. And what we're doing at HIF is to generate renewable electricity and make hydrogen from water using the electrolyzers, and then actually recombining the hydrogen with CO2 that we'll capture from the atmosphere. And when you do that recombination, you have, as Marco mentioned, methanol, which can easily be synthesized into gasoline, eventually jet fuel, or in fact used by the shipping industry simply as methanol. So it creates a way to make electricity into liquid fuels that can be transported around the world and used, in fact, in existing infrastructure today without modification. And we'll do that, until enough of a hydrogen market develops that we can actually just use the hydrogen itself. So hydrogen can be that bridge. And in fact, e-fuels are the bridge to developing the hydrogen market.
Meg, maybe you could talk just a little specifically about a couple of the projects that you're working on, because those in my mind make it a little more real than the sort of abstraction that we talk about. You're actually doing some of this.
Yeah, so 3 key places that we're active in southern Chile, in Magallanes, so all the way at the southern tip of Patagonia, in North America, and zoning in on a site, hopefully in Texas, and then also in Australia. We have a demonstration plant under construction today in southern Chile, and it will be producing hydrogen, methanol, and e-gasoline later this year. Porsche is actually purchasing the gasoline production from that facility. So, we're excited to bring e-gasoline into the European market. And then later this quarter, we'll be finalizing our site in the USA to basically do the same thing. And we'll be using wind power in both of those locations. And then we're looking for sites in Australia, either from wind or solar.
Fascinating. Well, let's talk again after you've got the US site locked in. I'd love to learn more about that. Let's go to David now.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you very much to you and the Atlantic Council for having me. And it's great to see so many friends and familiar faces on this panel. I just want to make clear that the United States not only recognizes the role that clean hydrogen can play in the clean energy transition, but this administration is really taking steps to drive that and accelerate that, not only at home, but also internationally. We view clean hydrogen as an important and versatile piece of the energy transition, something that can help us maintain, but also create new high quality jobs, can contribute to not only addressing the climate crisis, but also to cleaning up our air and water through various different clean hydrogen pathways. And we also know that this is a real area where we can harness some of the complementary and superlative strengths of the United States to other international partners in terms of our national labs, in terms of the innovative edge that our companies give us, not only in green hydrogen, but also blue hydrogen, nuclear to hydrogen, methane pyrolysis, and across the variety of different clean hydrogen pathways that we have in front of us. Just a couple highlights of what has already happened to date in less than the first year of this administration. We saw the bipartisan infrastructure law mobilize nearly $10 billion for hydrogen R&D, D&D. In June of last year, our Department of Energy, Secretary Granholm launched the Hydrogen Earthshot, which is the first activity under a broader Energy Earthshots initiative. And it aims to reduce the cost of hydrogen, of clean hydrogen production, to $1 per 1 kilogram within 1 decade. So that's 1 for 1 in 1 for the very first element, the periodic table. That would represent, just to put that in context, an 80% reduction in clean hydrogen costs versus today. Now, what a US industry estimate shows that if we achieve that, that has the potential for 16% carbon dioxide emissions reduction by 2050, as well as $140 billion in revenues and 700,000 jobs by 2030. So if we're able to actually mobilize to achieve this hydrogen earthshot, we unlock a tremendous amount of value and knock-on benefit through the clean energy transition and for the overall job and economic impact of the transition to clean hydrogen in several industries. And of course, this is also very complementary with what Secretary Kerry and the State Department has been leading on with the World Economic Forum in terms of industrial decarbonization, what we call our First Movers Coalition, trying to coalesce demand in key sectors like steel, aviation, shipping, and trucking so that we have early demand for some of the breakthrough technologies and solutions that will fully decarbonize these what have traditionally been considered hard to abate industrial sectors. We're going to need clean hydrogen as a solution in all four of those sectors I mentioned: steel, trucking, shipping, aviation. And so there's a lot of complementarity between the demand side initiatives that we're working on in the US government, the supply side push we have, and you can bet that it's also a key element of our climate diplomacy in many different parts of the world.
David, thank you so much. We're going to come back to some of the things you raised in a little bit, but I want to go to Alexander and think about and talk this. Have you talk about this question from the Masdar perspective and the UAE perspective, where the UAE and Masdar are pushing very hard on hydrogen and have a slightly different and come from a very different place than where Marco is and where Meg is.
Yeah, well, thank you. For the UAE, this is really an excellent opportunity. I mean, we have been a country that relied for decades on the rich hydrocarbon resources. And this gives us an opportunity to transition over to a clean energy supply system. So we are kind of blessed, with this resources, the hydrocarbon resources that gave us the expertise to produce hydrocarbons and export them to international markets. And this is what we can use now with hydrogen. We can basically capitalize on the infrastructure that we have in place for oil and gas exports, for the handling and for the refining of these hydrocarbon products, and use these expertise to apply it to whatever form of hydrogen we have, so either blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. And green hydrogen will be very cost effectively produced here in the UAE, but also in neighboring places, just because of the excellent renewable energy resources that we have, coupled with the space that is around. Also experience in putting up these large-scale power plants in the gigawatt range. Mm-hmm. So this will basically enable the UAE to offer two kinds of hydrogen products. One is based on green hydrogen, produced through renewable energy and water splitting. The other one would be used on blue hydrogen with carbon capture. There may be a third option to also work on, let's say, gasification routes, municipal solid waste gasification. There's still a huge potential here. A lot of waste is not diverted yet from the landfill. So by using that waste, we can put another stream of clean hydrogen. And yes, there will be two markets. The one is the domestic market, where we have a lot of industry here. We have a steel industry, as it was said. There is a lot of trucking industry also. Maybe even more importantly is the shipping industry, because we have a lot of international sea routes leaving from the UAE, going to all destinations in the world. We have big ports, and Masdar is actually in communication with those ports to find solutions. But most importantly, the UAE is known as an aviation hub. We have one of the largest airlines in the world, and we, as Masdar, have launched a pilot project now, whereby we are producing sustainable aviation fuel, purely made out of solar electricity and recycled CO2. And so that will be kind of a first step towards a commercialization later on to roll out sustainable aviation fuel. Firstly for our own airlines in the UAE, but then later on also for other airlines.
Alexander, thank you so much. We have two questions from the audience that are similar, and they're really for Marco. And I know when the audience is asking similar questions, I really want to get them out of the way and answer their demands. So Marco, just to get these two out of the way, they're about hydrogen pipelines. So how long will it take hydrogen pipelines to be in place? And I know that that's almost a trick question. And then a follow-on question, which is, what are the U.S. pipeline companies doing to convert their infrastructure for use with hydrogen? Again, almost a trick question. But Marco, I know you know the answers to this.
So it's really straightforward. We've been able to start blending high percentages of hydrogen into the existing system, and we've proven that we can deliver sustainably for long periods of time to customers without changing anything up to 10% blend. But I think the question is more about a full hydrogen pipe. And the great news is that we've assessed, we have around 40,000 kilometers of pipes, about 30,000 miles of pipes. We've assessed each and every single one of them, and 99% of our system, that's in Italy, Greece, Austria, France, Belgium, UK. 99% of the system is ready to take on 100% hydrogen. That means the quality of the steel that was used in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to build our natural gas pipelines, it's exactly the same that we would use today to build a dedicated, purpose-built 100% hydrogen pipe. Now, in the US, it's slightly different because some quality of steel is too hard, which means you have a phenomenon called embrittlement. But let's not despair, because really the value in our companies is not simply the steel below the ground, but it's really the right of ways. To build some of these corridors today with all the NIMBYism is really, really challenging. But you could very cheaply lay a pipe next door to an existing pipe, or you could do a pipe in pipe. And the real breakthrough is to build new pipes connecting like the Middle East to Europe. There's projects like that. When you look at it on an Excel chart, it turns out to be a lot cheaper than many of the alternatives, because you just don't have much energy loss in piping the hydrogen like you do for natural gas. So right now here in Italy, we're piping natural gas all the way from Siberia. Well, the Middle East is almost half of that distance. And hydrogen, even though it has less energy density, it travels faster, has less friction. So pipes are an incredible way to move hydrogen over long distances. The North American market will be a big market for this. When it comes to timing, we have committed to our investors to have a hydrogen backbone to be able to move green hydrogen molecules from North Africa into Europe before 2030. So that probably means 2029.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Thank you. You've address the audience's key concerns. Really want to make sure we do that here. So my colleague Dan Freed yesterday in another session for our Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week programming, in a totally different context, said something that I think is really relevant here, which is that we always overestimate what we can accomplish in the short term and underestimate what we can accomplish in the long term. Very, very wise, wise words. But what I want to try to do is think about this in terms of the hydrogen economy, because there's so much interest in hydrogen right now, and so much energy and discussion and money is going into hydrogen, and there's so many expectations placed on hydrogen. Are we pushing too hard across too many areas in the short term and not really thinking enough about what we're trying to accomplish in the long term? So I want to ask that to Alexander first, because you guys the UAE is known for thinking long term, but is making a huge amount of short term investments.
Well, thank you for the question. So, and I really think right now we need to focus. We need to start immediately. We need to tackle and roll it out as quickly as possible, the hydrogen infrastructure. So that goes both on the upstream and on the downstream infrastructure. So both need to be rolled out at the same time, and the accompanying policy and standard needs to be also put in place. If we wait too long, then this will inevitably lead to higher cost for the society. So the sooner you start and the quicker you start, the sooner you end, and then the economy of scale will come in and will make everything more affordable. and will make everything more feasible. If I don't think for hydrogen, for this transition, a very slow transition process would be too expensive, and so that's why we are working on a variety of projects. We are working on a variety of different application areas, and we tackle these in parallel.
Got it. David, do you want to tackle that question from a policy side? Just how to make sure to think through not just the short term, but the long-term ambitions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we can do as governments, and in our engagements in terms of our climate diplomacy and our dialogues with other countries, is we can ensure that we're sending the right signals, that we're being inclusive of a wide variety of clean hydrogen solutions, that we're being open with such a versatile energy source, that we're being very open to letting demand signals kind of dictate where hydrogen is going to be most valuable in the system over the near to midterm in terms of decarbonization and just delivering on its promise. And that we're allowing market structures to take place in a commercially logical way. That we're essentially allowing, to develop in the hydrogen space what happened in the gas market, where you're probably going to see the development of both contractual structures that mimic, long-term pipeline contracts, as well as the emergence of more LNG-like markets in the clean hydrogen space over time. And so what we can do is just make sure that we're creating a supportive ecosystem for that to take place. But we can also, in terms of our own international diplomacy, our climate diplomacy, we're really trying to make sure that we are accelerating conversations that need to happen between sources of demand and sources of supply. I think of that as happening along two different axes. That's both about conversations between governments and countries like the UAE or its neighbors in the GCC that are very rich sources of potential clean hydrogen export, as well as speaking with countries like Germany and its neighbors in Europe that represent extremely important potential markets. But this is also about facilitating a dialogue between hydrogen companies, hydrogen suppliers, and different sectors, and understanding the shape that different sectors are going to take and the unique decarbonization pathways that different sectors are going to have in different parts of the world. And so again, that's something that actually I think we're in a really unique position to do, given the fact that we're engaging not just in international climate diplomacy on a country to country level, but we've made it a point in the United States this year to really also be mindful of engaging with sectors as key actors in the energy transition as well. And so what we're doing with our First Movers Coalition, what we're doing with the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda, which is the first standing G7 body dedicated to climate, is focused on industrial decarbonization. With all of these different things, with our hosting a mission innovation next year in clean energy ministerial, we have a unique vantage point and an opportunity to interface with entire sectors, with CEOs that have global supply chains that cross borders, and to use that as a complement to the kind of hydrogen dialogues that we're running with countries. Just to give an example, last fall, we worked with the Department of Energy on a great hydrogen dialogue with Saudi Arabia. That's going to I hope set the stage for some further clean energy or clean hydrogen cooperation that we're very excited about. And this is going to take, again, a whole of government effort with multiple different pieces. The State Department playing its role, our Department of Energy playing its role, and hopefully we'll get some other tools, DFC and others across the USG, involved in some of these opportunities as they develop further.
Got it. No, thank you so much. Both Alexander and David made a point about clean hydrogen or blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. I don't want to have that debate here, but the question that I have, and I think everyone might have an interesting perspective on this, is do we need international standards on the carbon intensities of hydrogen. You can, blue hydrogen will have a different carbon intensity than green hydrogen. If some of the recent analysis that we've seen coming out of Europe is true, that on a life cycle basis, power from nuclear has a lower carbon intensity than power from renewables, then so-called pink hydrogen might actually be a lower carbon hydrogen than even green hydrogen. So is it useful to have international standards on the carbon content of hydrogen, particularly as we're talking about international trade? So maybe Marco, since you move hydrogen across countries, you're thinking about getting more involved in the United States. How do you think about international standards? And Meg, I want to ask you that as well, because you also are moving hydrogen from Chile to Europe, et cetera. How do you think about the potential for international standards, what that could actually do to help decarbonize?
I think this is a key point. I loved your comment before about being usually over ambitious on the short term. But if you actually look at what we need to do, a lot has to happen in the coming 4 to 5 years. We really need to get the abatement curve front loaded and accelerated before 2030. That means we won't have time to wait for green to come. We'll need plenty of blue hydrogen in places like Germany. They're trying to get out of nuclear, get out of coal, get out of diesel at the same time. This is a country that's running on nuclear, coal, and diesel. And so the only chance that Germany has, because they don't have a lot of sun, the wind is shared with Denmark. They don't want new onshore infrastructure because it's a very densely populated country. The only option really that German and other countries have is to import great quantities. So you need blue. Now, when it comes to blue, you need to be careful with two things. You can make blue with a lot of methane emissions, and you can make blue without a lot of CO2 captured. So you really need a formula that captures both, that really tries to make sure it's clean and it has along the entire value chain low emissions. Now, with oil and gas, you can really look at the quality of the product once it's on a ship, once it's on a pipe, and you can trace where it comes from. But hydrogen, because it's going to be chemically indistinguishable, whether it's green, blue, pink, gray, brown, black, we'll really need to not only define some global standards, but also we need to make sure that we have certificates of origin. So we know when it's on a ship, when it's in a pipe, where it came from and how it was made. So we really need to, as I was saying, front load a lot of these discussions, because we can't start a global traded market unless we define this upfront. And I know Europe, the UK, Germany, there's a lot of work happening, but that's a precondition to really get a global market going.
Got it. Thank you, Meg. How do you think about this working internationally?
I completely agree with Marco that we need to start establishing some of these standards now. Always easier to do in as we're beginning a new industry rather than trying to do it looking backward. We will produce green hydrogen, so meaning hydrogen from renewable energy. We won't have any carbon content at all in the hydrogen that is produced. And so those standards are going to be very, very important. I also agree with Marco that blue hydrogen is going to play a very, very important role in kickstarting the actual hydrogen market. And I think it's going to be important to distinguish the carbon content as we're trying to accomplish some pretty hefty goals on carbon reduction in our energy systems.
Thank you. Now, David, is the U.S. government working at all on this, trying to work on standards, or right now is that a little premature?
No, I think you see that starting to take place in a couple different fora. So, for example, I mean, Congress is going to have an important role to play in this, and I'll just note in the in the House passed Build Back Better bill, there is a hydrogen tax credit that is predicated on not colors of hydrogen, but what I think is most important, which is the actual scientifically measured life cycle greenhouse gas intensity of that hydrogen production. We're all going to obviously be watching very closely on what happens in the Senate over coming weeks and months on that front as well. In addition to that, I'm one of the co-chairs along with USTR and our Department of Energy in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. We've got a working group in there on climate and clean tech. And as part of that, we may have an opportunity to discuss and to to compare approaches on life cycle greenhouse gas footprinting, so that we're not each doing duplicative or or work that's comparing life cycle greenhouse gas emissions on an apples to orange basis, but we can converge as much as possible to make it easier in the transatlantic market for our companies to understand the sorts of frameworks that are going to be applied when measuring life cycle greenhouse gas intensity. And then I would just note that a lot of work is going to be done as well by those that are looking to support individual hydrogen projects as part of the many different Biden administration initiatives that I laid out at the beginning. It's worth noting the very first loan given out by our DOE loan program office has gone to a company that's looking at methane pyrolysis to produce clean hydrogen that can be used in fertilizers and other applications in the industrial sector, and then also to produce carbon black that has a real economic use as well. They will have done their own, life cycle greenhouse gas analysis that'll be really valuable and that others can take a look at and learn from when looking at these gas pyrolysis sorts of projects. So we have several different areas and domains in which we're working on GHG footprinting. We have some vectors and opportunities to compare that and bring that into a dialogue with international partners as well. And we'll be obviously keeping a close eye on what you just heard industry is going to be doing, working with among themselves and also with regulators to ensure that the standards that are brought to bear ensure not just climate credibility, but also safety of transport, storage, and usage of clean hydrogen going forward.
Got it. Thank you, David. And I really think the opportunity with methane pyrolysis is something that needs to be discussed more, particularly because there is the market for carbon black. It does finally find that market that people have been talking about when you say the CCUS, the utilization really has been the missing piece of that for so long. So I think we should be talking much more about that. We have two questions from the audience that are related to the color scheme of hydrogen. I want to address that before we move on from this topic. So first for Alexander, and this is coming from our senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Bob Eichord, and he asks about the economics of using nuclear power from Baraka for hydrogen production, particularly during times of non-peak load. So it's essentially the winter in the UAE right about now. Is that something that the UAE is considering? And how does the UAE think through having that remarkable clean energy source when it's thinking about its hydrogen economy?
Yeah, so it's another source that the UAE has, and yes, we are considering to utilize it. It is very low carbon, and it is a base load. We basically have for the green or the pink hydrogen or the electrically produced hydrogen, we have a mix of resources that we can use, and I think the ideal will be to complement those together. So while in certain periods of the year, there is even an excess of renewables available. So whenever there is no cooling demand, for example, then there is still a significant production of solar electricity. And this is a surplus production. So this surplus production is ideally being used by electrolyzers. Versus then in the reverse situation in the summer months when we have a lot of air conditioning demand and the solar power is maybe completely utilized for those demand, then the reliance on nuclear will complement it and will provide us an additional clean electric source to come up with the green hydrogen.
That is really interesting that you think about switching the power source based on the need for cooling. That's fascinating, and I think we should talk more about that in the future. I think people will be really interested in that thinking and how the economics work and how that changes as the cost of electrolyzers come down. Right now, of course, you need to be using the electrolyzer almost all the time in order to make it cost effective. But as the cost comes down, you might have more flexibility in that and can use surplus power in a more interesting way. We had one other question about the the color system of hydrogen, which is an interesting one, particularly for the moment. It comes from Megan Richards, and Marco and Meg. You both may be the best position to think about this, given Meg your previous life in the natural gas industry, and Marco your ongoing life working in natural gas. But the question is about the cost of blue versus green hydrogen and the high price of natural gas right now. How does that impact the economics, particularly as you're thinking, as Marco and others have said, you'll probably need blue in the short to medium term as the green hydrogen production ramps up. How does a world in which natural gas prices, let's say they stay high for a while, as some are arguing they will, how does that impact those timelines for developing hydrogen? Will there not be enough hydrogen for all the demand cases that we see? So Marco and
Okay.
then Meg.
So I think we have almost infinite natural gas. I mean, in 2006, when I started working in gas, we had 26 years left of gas reserves. Now we have more than 400. And there's no limit of how much of the deserts you can fill up with solar panels, and where there's wind with wind farms. So there's almost infinite supply of both. The cost competitiveness will really depend on the season and on the geography. So let's just put some numbers. Let's say a new nuclear costs today 100, and the most, I'm talking dollars per megawatt hour. And the cheapest nuclear, when you standardize it, you build a smaller scale reactors, you can probably get down to 50. Some people even say 40. The latest solar auctions in Saudi Arabia were at $10.4 per megawatt hour. So where you have sun, it's really hard to beat the sun. Natural gas goes from like $2 a megawatt hour in upstream countries where maybe you have stranded gas to like $150 a megawatt hour in the winter in Europe or in Asia. So if you're in a gas producing country like the US, as demand for natural gas falls, you will get excess supply and you'll have prices really chasing the market. And so I suspect blue will always be competitive where you have upstream gas, whether it's Qatar, whether it's Russia, whether it's the United States. Where you're an importer of natural gas, like in Japan, Korea, where you don't have any pipes, and so you're really relying on LNG, then your price of natural gas is just a function of how much storage you have, how much gas you've been able to buy in the summer, because gas, all the demand is in the northern hemisphere. There's a lot of seasonality. No one really wants, going back to Alexander's point, you really need to look what you're using it for. So the bottom line is, in sunny place that doesn't have a lot of gas, you can't beat solar. If you have sun and wind like Chile, it's really hard to beat green eventually when those electrolyzer costs come down. Because again, if you think about solar at 10 today, maybe going down to 7, then it's really cheap to convert that to hydrogen. David was talking about the earth shot. That $1 a kilo, by the way, means about $25 a megawatt hour. That's a quarter of the price of nuclear today. That's half the price of oil. Well, it's a quarter of the price of oil today. It's half of the price of kind of pre-COVID normalized oil. So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about green hydrogen in sunny and windy places getting cheaper, a lot cheaper than oil is today. But where you don't have a lot of sun and wind, like in Russia, I mean, blue is always going to be a lot cheaper. So I'm sorry, I can't give one answer fits all, but we really need to think about a new map evolving where the sunny and windy places, if you have both sun and wind, you can really think about new countries becoming big exporters of green energy.
Marco, thank you so much. That's a really fantastic answer. Meg, any thoughts on this, just given your experience in the natural gas markets?
So I'd add one thing, Randy, and that is that green hydrogen, since it's produced from renewable power, clearly the intermittency of the renewable electricity has to be taken into consideration. And as we look at the projects in Chile, wind in Chile, and I've been there to Magallanes, I can say it is definitely blowing all of the time. So the capacity factor of that wind electricity is about 75%. So some of the highest quality wind in the world, and very, very little interruption of the production of the hydrogen. By contrast, Texas wind is only about 40% capacity factor. And so we have to, overbuild the capacity, which changes the economics a lot. Fortunately, the interconnectivity of lots of different sources of power in the ERCOT system in Texas allows us to overcome that intermittency in the wind power, and so that's such an important factor, as you would imagine, in the cost of the electricity. Is what is the capacity factor, and how can you balance that out with other sources in the system?
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I want to move on to a highly contentious question, particularly in the European context. Always like to ask the hard questions. This one is going to be about additionality. We've been talking obviously a lot about the value, the opportunity of producing green hydrogen, the economics of it, what the problems it's going to solve are. But if you just look at the numbers, you're going to need a lot of new clean power to produce hydrogen at a scale that will decarbonize the sectors we hope it decarbonizes. And some of the figures are pretty astounding. So for instance, just if you just wanted to decarbonize the current global use of hydrogen, you would need all of the installed renewable capacity as of, I think, the end of 2018. So you're just talking about a huge amount of power. And so in Europe, they've been talking about the concept of additionality, that if you're going to be producing green hydrogen, it needs to be from additional clean power. You can't be taking power off the grid that is already needed for decarbonizing the grid. So you have these competing demands. The decarbonizing the grid, of course, really important, particularly in a moment when the power, when electricity prices are so high. This seems quite relevant. How do we think through the concept of additionality, whether the Europeans have it right or not, when we know we need to decarbonize the grid, when we know we need to produce all this hydrogen? Should we be dedicating clean power to hydrogen production so that the power so that you don't take away from the grid? Or, as Meg just suggested, it's actually even beneficial to be taking power from the grid for the hydrogen, because then you don't have to manage the intermittency challenge as much. So I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this concept of additionality, how clean power for hydrogen interacts or does not interact with the grid. So let's talk to Alexander first on this and think about how the UAE is thinking about it, and then we'll go through everybody else.
Yeah, so we are aware about the additionality criteria, especially as championed by Europe. And I mean, we understand the logic behind, and I think there is a good reason for it, because, without this requirement, you're basically operating electrolyzers on renewables, and you force other users of the would have used that renewable to switch over to conventional fossil fuel. So then there is no benefit in it, right? So there is a good logic behind this criteria of additionality. So now the question is, how is it going to be defined? And this is currently under discussion. And I think it's important to make these definitions carefully. Because there may be, for a reason, instances whereby the use of already existing renewable assets that are non-additional can still provide benefits. So, for example, if there is a wind farm that produces a surplus wind during hours where there is no demand, that would otherwise be curtailed, that wind could be used to convert into hydrogen. And so this should be eligible in our opinion to qualify or to satisfy the additionality criteria. And well, if it comes to larger infrastructure assets, it becomes maybe even more difficult to define additionality. If it's a modular energy supply system like a solar system or a wind farm, then one can easily say, okay, you're a project developer installs a a 300 megawatt electrolyzer, you need to also install a 300 or 400 megawatt wind farm or solar farm. If there is, for example, a hydroelectric facility already in place that may also have surplus power, then obviously this could not be installed as an additional. The same applies to nuclear power, right? I mean, this is impossible to just build a nuclear plant just to satisfy addition. So I think the definition of additionality needs to be carefully drafted in order to satisfy these different cases of use cases of renewable electrolyzers and available or new renewable assets.
Alexander, that's really, really thoughtful and helpful thinking through this. Meg messaged me in the chat and said she had some thoughts on this. So Meg, let's go to you.
I can share some, specific numbers of how we're thinking about additionality in North America, and so as we develop the Texas facility, and across 3 plants, we will produce almost 1 million gallons, 1 million tons a year of hydrogen, which will satisfy, decarbonization about just over 1 million cars on the road today. So just to kind of put in perspective the size, it also requires about 6 gigawatts of power. But when you consider the capacity factor of Texas wind, that's about 15 gigawatts of additionality in terms of power capacity that has to be built. As you can imagine, 15 gigawatts of power, that's an enormous portfolio. And so there's a lot of pieces that have to be put in place to come together at the same time. You need electrolyzer production capacity to produce the units. They need to have some flexibility in them. So when you look at the underlying technology, whether it's alkaline electrolyzers or PEM electrolyzers, they have different capabilities to have flexibility for intermittency. And then you have to actually build the plant and build the power plant. So the way we're thinking about it in Texas is we can get the plant built and start building the power portfolio. The additionality is very, very important to us so that everything is based on green hydrogen. And as that power portfolio is ramping up, we can also access the grid. And because we have in place the mechanisms in ERCOT to ensure that we are purchasing green power, even though it's coming off the grid, it can be coming from green sources that are in existence today and producing electricity, or if not renewable, zero carbon nuclear power that is already existing. Mm-hmm. So in places like Texas, where there's already an enormous amount of infrastructure, we can take advantage of the grid to move faster on completing, the hydrogen plant, if you would, while we are also ramping up the electricity and making sure that we have that 15 gigawatts of additionality.
Got it. Thank you. That's a really robust plan, and I'd love to talk more about that offline. It's really interesting, and it's an area of work that the Atlantic Council will be diving into this year, is thinking through that additionality question. Marco, from the European side, what is your perspective on it?
I think hydrogen is really coming to the rescue of the grid. I mean, the grids are all bottlenecked. We have curtailment already. And so there's no question of additionality. It's not an issue. It's the other way around. I mean, hydrogen allows us to go and get energy, renewable energy from offshore wind, places where it's hard to see how it could add much value to a grid that's already really stranded. I mean, the grids are tight everywhere. If you look at California, if you look at Texas, as Meg says, there's times of the day when you have spare capacity, there's times of the day when you're really stretched. Let's keep in mind that these grids were not designed to move electrons over great distances. The average an electron travels is around 80 miles. Because the grids were built around power plants to kind of transport the energy to the local areas. If you think about gas, for example, the average gas molecules travels like 600 miles. So you're kind of looking at hydrogen not as a way to take energy, renewable energy away from the grid, but to actually help reduce the strain on grids where, as I said, you have a lot of NIMBYism to build new high voltage grids, because a high voltage grid will essentially lower the value of real estate it cuts across. And so people are really reluctant to have this infrastructure built. When it comes to the costs, if you look at electricity on a grid, electricity coming off a grid is probably around $150 to $200 a megawatt hour. If you go back to the $10 sunny places, you have this big economic gap. So that's why you're not going to be building big electrolyzers at point of consumption. You're much better off building big electrolyzers at point of production, and then either converting that into an e-fuel like Meg is doing, or as we mentioned before, piping it or converting it into transition fuel, which could be ammonia or methanol or stuff like that.
So, I mean, that I want to dig a little deeper into this. It's a really good point that while the question of additionality makes a lot of sense if you're thinking just about sort of producing hydrogen in Europe, the grid also needs hydrogen to balance, to help relieve congestion, et cetera. So in terms of the European policy context, specifically as they're thinking through additionality, what would you recommend? How do you recommend them thinking through this?
So so Europe will import a lot of hydrogen from the Middle East and from North Africa, and from blue hydrogen from Russia. And so there's no question about it. I mean, it's very clearly in the policies already of the German government, of the European Commission. And so that's already, every molecule import, it's already solving for additionality. There's no question to me that whatever you can electrify directly, you should. So there's going to be a merit order where it's just super convenient to put more solar where it's sunny. But if I look at the map of Europe, the best locations have already been taken. I mean, we've been going for 20 years now with solar and wind developments. And so as you go further out offshore, you're studying that you're better off to convert that offshore wind into hydrogen, and then use that hydrogen, exactly like you say, to balance the grid. So a lot of policy effort is going to be around the kind of energy services. That's not really the LCOE. We're going to have to move beyond LCOE, which is levelized cost of the energy, into something more sophisticated, which is around the flexibility. And so people more and more will need to build offshore with batteries. And the next step is offshore with hydrogen, so that you can provide some electricity, but turn that into a base load. Going back to what Alexander was saying, the grids love the base load. We need to replace coal and gas, and in Germany, nuclear as well. And so hydrogen will really help balance those swings. So you're going to have a beautiful system eventually, where whenever you have a very windy week in the UK, you will use that wind to turn it into hydrogen with electrolyzers that you can store underground. And then when you have, like we had in September, like 3 weeks with no wind, then you have all this beautiful hydrogen underground that with fuel cells or turbines, you can turn back into electricity. So you're going to have a price band where you have a cap and a floor for the price of power. Whenever it's below a certain level, because there's excess renewable, that floor is going to be just how much you can convert into hydrogen. And then whenever it's above a certain level, that ceiling is going to be the cost of converting that hydrogen back into power. If I were to guess, that band is going to be between kind of 30 to kind of 80, 90. And so it's going to mean a lot cheaper electricity than we have today, but much more resilient systems. And as I said, additionality is not a problem. It's really much more of an opportunity.
Got it. Thank you. Now, final comment. We're running out of time. So, David Livingston, any thoughts on this from a policy, international cooperation perspective, particularly as U.S. and U.S. companies are looking to develop hydrogen projects in Europe or elsewhere? How U.S. is thinking through this additionality question?
Well, on additionality, I'm not a regulator, so I don't want to, give any comments that are misconstrued as such. I certainly understand that there's probably a nuance here that we can all be thoughtful about between the, additionality of any particular energy project meant to power hydrogen operations, right? The additionality of the renewable facility that's then connected to, an electrolyzer and a clean hydrogen project, versus the additionality of the decarbonization opportunity. And I think if we do, if we're mindful of thinking about the additionality that presents itself in terms of what additional decarbonization are you unlocking through various different creative uses of both existing and new greenfield assets, I think that's going to, help us have an open mind and think through the most strategic way forward. Where is our climate diplomacy going to come in? We want to hear from companies that see real opportunities in markets around the world, because when you succeed in those markets around the world, not only are you helping, advance, the hydrogen cause, hydrogen technology, and advancing the use of hydrogen as a new energy vector in multiple different sectors, but you're also helping us, with this critical year of implementation, to take the raised ambition that we came away from COP26 with, and to make sure that as we head into COP27, we have a real sight on steel that's going to go into the ground on new clean hydrogen projects over this critical decade. So we want to hear from you. We want to work together. And we want to also make sure that we are using our climate diplomacy, using our energy transition diplomacy effectively, so that we are connecting dots where dots need to be connected. So that in a region like the GCC, in a region like Europe, in a region like South America, we're looking for opportunities to harmonize the utilization of infrastructure in the most intelligent way, to piggyback on existing efforts, to coordinate, so that we can scale up hydrogen in a way that looks as much as possible like a symphony and not a cacophony. The opportunity here is really significant. I just want to leave you with one note. The emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions of hydrogen as a sector today, of hydrogen production today, are more than the UK and Indonesia combined. We talk all the time in Secretary Kerry's office about the engagement work we're doing with major economies around the world to decarbonize. If you think about UK and Indonesia combined, hydrogen as a sector is a major economy. It's a major opportunity. And so as we go and we support, blue hydrogen efforts, green hydrogen efforts, gas pyrolysis, nuclear to hydrogen, multiple different clean hydrogen pathways, we're really looking forward to taking a big chunk out of that source of emissions over this coming decade and unlocking a lot of value in the process of doing so.
David, thank you so much. A wonderful way to end this. Hugely ambitious. Yes, the current hydrogen market, something like 100 million tons a year. A lot of opportunity there. So we are out of time. So thank you so much, Marco, Meg, David, and Alexander. A really robust conversation. It's great that we're continuing to move this conversation along. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. The session will be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, and social media. Please do share with your colleagues. We will have one more ADSW Global Energy Forum session tomorrow on pathways to reaching net zero. This session will be live at 8 a.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Gulf Standard. Make sure to follow us at AC Global Energy and share your thoughts using the hashtags AC Energy Forum and ADSW22. ADSW22. I haven't gotten that right all week. We also hope to see you in person at the Global Energy Forum in the UAE on March 28th and 29th. Again, we will have more information on that soon. And thank you to everyone who put this event together today, including Olga Kokova, Iveta Kruma, Katie Kenny, Jackson Styron, Eamon Coughlin, Zach Tarrant, Bain Ennis, and Lisi Bowen. Thank you all so much, and we will see you back here tomorrow.